Imagine waking up to find your neighbor dead. Your street silent. No priest brave enough to bury the bodies. That was daily life in 1347. At first, it was just whispers, sailors arriving sick, towns sealing their gates. But soon, the plague swept across Europe like wildfire. One by one, houses emptied. Entire villages disappeared. Bells tolled so often that silence itself became suspicious. The Black Death didn't just kill. It dismantled society. Kings lost power. Faith was shaken. Families turned on each other. This wasn't only the deadliest pandemic in history. It was a turning point that reshaped the world forever. And even the words we use carry the weight of that terror. The word plague comes from the Latin plaga, meaning a blow or a wound. People saw the disease as something striking humanity down. Pandemic comes from two Greek parts, pan for all and demos for people. A sickness that spares no one. Bubonic plague comes from the Greek bubon, swelling. Doctors recognized the painful swelling which was called buboes, that marked the infected. As for Black Death, that name appeared later, in the 1350s and 1400s. It may have come from the Latin atra mors. Atra could mean both black and terrible. So the phrase could mean the Black Death or simply the terrible death. Over time, people imagined the black as the dark patches that spread across the skin when the infection poisoned the blood. So when we say Black Death, we're not just naming an illness. We're speaking a phrase shaped by fear, language, and memory. Now, let us step back to the 14th century. Let us imagine the world before this disease struck. Life was already fragile, but no one expected what was coming. Chapter 1: Europe before the plague. In the early 1300s, Europe was alive with energy, but it was also fragile. The population had grown over the past 2 centuries. Towns were larger. Markets were busier. Ships carried goods across the Mediterranean, and caravans connected east and west along the Great Silk Road. To many, it seemed as if progress was steady. But beneath the surface, the conditions of life left people vulnerable to disaster. Most people in medieval Europe lived close together, often in poor sanitation. Waste from humans and animals ran openly through the streets. Wells and rivers, the main sources of drinking water, were easily polluted. Rats thrived in this environment, feeding on scraps and rubbish. On those rats lived fleas, small insects that fed on blood. Neither rat nor flea was unusual to people of the time. They were part of daily life. But they would become the carriers of something far deadlier than anyone could imagine. The everyday life of most Europeans was already harsh. In 1315, a great famine struck. Heavy rains ruined harvests. Crops failed year after year. Animals died for lack of feed. Grain, the staple food, disappeared from markets. The famine lasted until 1317, and even when it ended, the population had been weakened. Malnutrition meant that many people, especially children, grew up with fragile bodies and weaker defenses against illness. To be malnourished means not getting enough of the nutrients the body needs to fight off disease. This is important, because a hungry population is more likely to fall to infection when it comes. Society itself was rigidly organized. Kings and nobles ruled over the land, while peasants worked as laborers or serfs. A serf was bound to the land of a lord and could not leave without permission. Their lives were tied to farming, from sunrise to sunset, in fields of grain or pastures for sheep. Towns offered a different life, with trade, guilds, and crafts, but even their conditions were cramped and unsanitary. The church was the central institution. Priests and bishops guided spiritual life, and monasteries preserved books and learning. But medicine was primitive. Physicians relied on the ancient Greek and Roman theories of Hippocrates and Galen. Chief among these was the theory of the 4 humors. These humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed health meant keeping these fluids in balance. Sickness was thought to mean imbalance. To cure, they might bleed a patient to reduce blood, or use herbs to purge the body. None of this could fight real infection, because the true cause, tiny living organisms, was unknown. The word germ would not be used until centuries later. When people fell ill, explanations were often spiritual. Many believed disease was punishment from God for sins. Others thought the stars and planets influenced health. Astrology was not just fortune-telling, it was a respected part of medical thought. Some even feared that illness was caused by poison or witchcraft. In such a world, science as we understand it today did not exist. Instead, explanations were a mixture of religion, tradition, and guesswork. Daily life continued despite these dangers. Villagers planted crops in spring and harvested in autumn. Merchants traveled from town to town, carrying wool, wine, or salt. Children played in muddy streets. Families gathered in wooden houses with thatched roofs. People feared hunger more than disease, for hunger was common and visible. Yet in a few decades, hunger would no longer be the greatest fear. Death, swift and unseen, would sweep across Europe. The political world was also unstable. In 1337, war erupted between England and France. This conflict, later called the 100 Years' War, brought armies across the continent. Soldiers traveled with horses, carts, and baggage. War always spread disease, because it forced people into camps with poor hygiene and close contact. The war was only one example of how Europe's network of movement, trade, pilgrimage, conquest, created channels through which disease could travel. Far to the east, in the steppes of Central Asia, traders carried silk, porcelain, and spices. Alongside goods came animals, vermin, and unseen dangers. It was here that the bacterium later named Yersinia pestis was carried by fleas on wild rodents. From Central Asia it moved westward along the Silk Road. Eventually, it would reach ports on the Black Sea and from there, the wider Mediterranean. No one at the time could see a bacterium. The microscope had not been invented. Yet this microscopic creature would kill more people in Europe than any war, famine, or empire before it. This was Europe on the eve of the Black Death, crowded, hungry, devout, and scientifically unprepared. People lived their lives within rhythms of farming, worship, and trade, not knowing that within their lifetime, half of their neighbors might vanish. They had survived famine, war, and poverty. But what was about to come would test the very structure of their society and the limits of human endurance. Chapter 2: The Arrival of the Plague, 1347. In the year 1347, the first signs of a terrible new illness reached Europe. It came not by rumor, but by ship. To understand its path, we must follow the routes of trade that bound continents together. At the heart of the story is a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This organism is so small that millions can fit on the head of a pin. It lives inside the gut of fleas. Fleas are tiny insects that feed on blood. Normally they bite rats and other rodents. But when an infected rat dies, the flea seeks another host. That host can be another animal, or a human being. The plague bacterium can take several forms in the body. The most common is the bubonic form, named from the Greek word bubon, meaning groin, or swelling. The name comes from the painful lumps, called buboes, that appear in the groin, armpit, or neck. Another form is pneumonic plague, where the lungs are infected. This is more dangerous because it spreads directly from person to person through the air when a sick person coughs. A third form is septicemic plague, in which the bacteria enter the blood and multiply quickly. This form often causes black patches on the skin and death within hours. But in 1347, people had no knowledge of bacteria, fleas, or transmission. They saw only sudden sickness, grotesque swellings, and swift death. The story of its European arrival begins on the shores of the Black Sea. In the trading city of Kaffa, on the Crimean Peninsula, Italian merchants maintained a busy port. In 1346, the city came under siege by an army from the Mongol Golden Horde. During the siege, plague broke out among the besieging soldiers. Contemporary accounts claim that the attackers hurled the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, spreading infection inside. Whether or not this exact detail is true, what is certain is that plague appeared within the city. Italian merchants fled by ship, hoping to escape. But the disease traveled with them. By October of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships arrived in the port of Messina, in Sicily. When the ships docked, many sailors were already dead. Others lay dying, covered in black swellings and fever. The city authorities, terrified, ordered the ships out of the harbor. But the damage was done. The disease had entered southern Italy. From there, it spread like fire across the Mediterranean world. The speed was astonishing. In 1 year, the plague moved from Sicily through Italy to France and Spain, then northward to England and Germany. By 1350, it had reached Scandinavia. It traveled along sea routes and overland by merchants and soldiers. Every connection, every port, every caravan road, became a path for the disease. Witnesses struggled to describe what they saw. A chronicler in Messina wrote that swellings appeared in the groin or under the armpits, some as large as an egg, some as a small apple. After these swellings, fever, vomiting, and death followed, often within 3 days. In pneumonic cases, coughing blood signaled almost certain death. Communities searched desperately for causes. Many believed in miasma, a theory that bad air carried disease. People lit fires of herbs and incense, hoping to cleanse the air. Others turned to religion, believing the illness was divine punishment. In many places, Jews and other minorities were falsely accused of poisoning wells. This led to violent persecutions, compounding the tragedy with human cruelty. It is important to pause here and explain miasma. The word comes from Greek, meaning pollution or stain. It was the idea that foul smells, such as those from rotting bodies or sewage, carried invisible poisons that made people ill. Though incorrect, it seemed logical in a world where disease often followed filth. From Sicily, the disease moved to Genoa and Venice, both major Italian ports. In January of 1348, it reached Marseille in France. By March, it spread inland to Avignon, then the seat of the Pope. That summer, it swept into Spain and northern Italy. By autumn, it had crossed the Channel into England, arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Within weeks, it spread to London. The records from England describe sudden devastation. Parish registers, the lists of baptisms, marriages, and burials, show entire families erased in months. Monks wrote of whole monasteries emptied. Some villages lost everyone, leaving only empty houses. The plague did not stop at borders. By 1349, it struck Germany and the Low Countries. In 1350, it reached Scandinavia. Merchants carried it by sea to Norway, and from there it moved inland. By the mid-1350s, it had traveled east into Russia. Nowhere was safe. This speed shows how connected the medieval world was. Though we imagine the past as isolated, trade and travel linked Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Goods, people, and ideas moved along these routes. So too did disease. Imagine being a villager then. News traveled slower than the plague. One week you might hear rumors from a distant town. By the time you wondered if it was true, sickness had arrived at your door. Fear spread even faster than the disease. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 was not just the start of a medical crisis. It was the opening of a social, religious, and cultural earthquake. Europe would never be the same. Chapter 3: The Scale of Death. Between the years 1347 and 1351, the Black Death swept across Europe with a level of destruction that no one had ever seen before. It is difficult, even today, to grasp the true scale. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide. In Europe alone, at least 1 out of every 3 people perished. In some regions, it may have been 1 out of every 2. Imagine half of everyone you know gone within a few years. That was the reality of the Black Death. Death came quickly. In its bubonic form, the plague killed in a matter of days. A person could be healthy on Monday and buried by Thursday. In its pneumonic form, it killed even faster, sometimes within 24 hours. And in the rare but most deadly form, septicemic plague, death could come in less than a single day. There was no time for families to prepare, no time for priests to give last rites, no time for communities to adapt. Eyewitnesses left us chilling descriptions. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in the preface to his book The Decameron, wrote that swellings appeared in the groin or under the armpits, some of which grew as large as an apple, others as an egg, and from these the plague developed. He said that the sickness spread from one person to another, as if fire caught from dry or oily matter. He described fathers abandoning children, wives leaving husbands, and whole families deserting their loved ones in fear. In many towns, the death toll was so great that there were not enough living people to bury the dead. Priests and gravediggers themselves often died. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves, called plague pits, became common. Sometimes carts moved through the streets, calling for people to bring out their dead. In London, one such pit in East Smithfield is believed to have held thousands of bodies. The psychological effect was immense. People who survived lived in constant fear. Some turned inward, closing themselves away and refusing contact with neighbors. Others gave themselves over to wild living, drinking, and excess, believing death would come soon regardless. Still others turned to deep piety, fasting, and prayer, hoping to appease an angry God. Social order began to weaken. With so many officials, priests, and city leaders dead, laws were hard to enforce. Crime rose. Violence erupted in some areas. In others, despair and silence dominated. But not all responses were selfish or violent. There were also acts of courage. Some doctors, though powerless, continued to tend the sick. Monks and nuns cared for plague victims even when it meant certain death. Ordinary neighbors sometimes risked themselves to bring food or water to those in quarantine. Humanity showed both its darkest and its noblest sides during this catastrophe. The scale of death also left physical marks on the land. Fields went untilled. Harvests rotted in the ground. Animals wandered without owners. In some villages, not a single soul survived. In others, perhaps only one or two families remained, surrounded by empty houses and silence. In cities, weeds grew in abandoned streets. The sound of bells tolling for the dead was constant. Let us pause to explain a few terms. A pandemic is different from an epidemic. Both words come from Greek. Epi means upon, and demos means people. An epidemic is a disease that comes upon a people in a specific area. A pandemic, with pan meaning all, is a disease that affects people across many regions or continents. The Black Death was truly a pandemic, for it stretched from Asia to the Middle East, North Africa, and nearly all of Europe. The death toll also shifted the balance of power in society. With so many workers gone, fields could not be harvested, and nobles struggled to find labor. Survivors were suddenly more valuable. In time, peasants would use this new leverage to demand better wages and conditions. But in the years 1347 to 1351, there was only grief and devastation. It is worth remembering that people in the 14th century had no clear understanding of what was happening. They did not know about bacteria or fleas. They could not see a cause. All they saw was that family after family vanished, street after street was emptied, and town after town was silenced. Imagine living in a small village of 100 people. Within a year, perhaps 60 are gone. The blacksmith, the baker, the priest, all gone. The fields lie empty. The bells no longer ring, for there is no one left to ring them. That was the experience repeated across a continent. By 1351, the first great wave of the plague began to ease. But the population of Europe had been transformed. A continent of 75 million people had lost perhaps 25 million in just a few years. It was, and remains, the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. Chapter 4: Medicine and Belief. Medicine in the 14th century was a very different field than it is today. People did not know about bacteria, viruses, or the immune system. The word germ itself would not exist until centuries later. What physicians of the time had were theories passed down from the ancient Greeks and Romans, mixed with religious beliefs and local traditions. When the Black Death struck, these ideas were put to the test, and most proved powerless. The most common medical framework was the theory of the four humors. The word humor comes from the Latin humor, meaning fluid or moisture. According to this system, the body contained four main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to be a balance of these humors. Illness meant imbalance. Treatments aimed to restore harmony. If a patient had a fever, a doctor might think there was too much blood and order bloodletting, cutting a vein to let blood flow out. If digestion was poor, they might prescribe purges or laxatives to expel waste. Herbs, baths, and diets were also common. Against the plague, none of this worked. A patient with a high fever might be bled, but instead of improving, they grew weaker and died faster. Another belief was in miasma. This word, from Greek, meant pollution or stain. Miasma theory held that bad air, filled with foul smells from sewage, swamps, or rotting bodies, caused disease. During the Black Death, people lit fires of herbs, incense, or even animal dung, believing smoke would cleanse the air. Wealthier households carried sweet-smelling flowers or spices. Doctors designed beak-shaped masks, filled with herbs, to protect themselves from miasma. These are the famous plague doctor outfits we picture today: long cloaks, gloves, and a bird-like mask with glass eyes. While dramatic, the clothing gave little real protection. But the beak, stuffed with herbs like rosemary or lavender, was thought to filter the poisoned air. Religion was central to explanations of disease. Many saw the plague as punishment from God for human sin. People responded with fasting, prayer, and public acts of repentance. One striking movement was that of the flagellants. These were groups of men who traveled from town to town, whipping their own backs with chains or rods, drawing blood. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could atone for the sins of humanity and persuade God to lift the plague. At first, they inspired fear and awe. But the church soon condemned them, as their practices often spread panic and sometimes violence. Fear also led to scapegoating. Minority communities, especially Jews, were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells or food supplies. These accusations were false, born of fear and ignorance. But in many towns, they led to brutal massacres and expulsions. Entire Jewish communities in Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere were destroyed. This shows how human responses to crisis can create tragedies within tragedies. Yet there were also the beginnings of more practical measures. Some cities noticed that isolating the sick helped reduce spread. In the port of Ragusa, in present-day Croatia, officials ordered ships arriving from infected areas to wait before docking. At first, they required 30 days, later extended to 40. The Italian word for 40, quaranta, gave us the modern word quarantine. This practice, keeping newcomers separate for a set time, was one of the few effective steps of the age, though people did not understand the true reason it worked. Doctors also began recording cases, noting symptoms, outcomes, and patterns. Though they lacked correct explanations, these records laid early foundations for observation in medicine. Some city governments required lists of the dead to be kept, a grim but useful step in tracking the scale of the disaster. Still, most treatments remained ineffective. People tried charms, magic words, or astrological remedies. Some wore amulets inscribed with holy names. Others believed bathing in vinegar or drinking certain wines would protect them. A few physicians advised leaving infected cities altogether. This advice, though limited to the wealthy who could afford to flee, was sometimes effective. Avoiding exposure reduced risk. The plague doctor costume deserves a closer look. It became iconic, though it was not common in 1347 to 1351, and was used more in later outbreaks. The long robe was coated with wax or oil, meant to repel contagion. The beaked mask held dried flowers, herbs, or vinegar-soaked sponges. The glass eye openings gave a bird-like appearance. While ineffective against fleas and bacteria, the costume created a barrier of sorts. It also became a powerful symbol of the plague, one that still shapes our imagination of the period. The deeper truth was that medicine of the time could not stop the Black Death. Without knowledge of microorganisms, without antibiotics, and without modern hygiene, all treatments failed. Faith, fear, and ritual filled the gap. Yet within this failure, seeds of progress grew. Quarantine, record-keeping, and the recognition that disease could spread from person to person would become important in the centuries ahead. The plague forced people to think not only of sin and fate, but also of patterns and prevention. For the people of the 14th century, however, the reality was clear. No doctor, priest, or charm could stop the tide. Families watched helplessly as loved ones fell, one after another. Communities prayed, bled, and burned herbs, but still the plague moved on. The gap between belief and reality had never been wider. Chapter 5: Society Transformed. The Black Death did not only bring death. It also brought change. When nearly half of Europe's population vanished, society itself was reshaped. The world that survived was not the same as the one that entered the plague years. Let us begin with the most obvious change: labor. Fields needed workers. Workshops needed hands. But millions of peasants, craftsmen, and servants were gone. Labor became scarce. Those who survived were suddenly more valuable. In many regions, peasants began to demand better wages, better food, and more freedom. Some left their villages and sought work in towns, where employers were desperate to find help. This challenged the old system of feudalism. Feudalism was the medieval structure in which lords owned the land and peasants, often serfs, were bound to work it. A serf could not simply leave and look for a new master. But after the plague, with so many dead, lords could not enforce their power so easily. Survivors had choices. If one lord refused to pay well, another would. Over time, this eroded the rigid bonds of feudal society. In England, these pressures boiled over into open rebellion. In 1381, a generation after the plague, peasants rose up in what is called the Peasants' Revolt. They demanded an end to serfdom and fairer conditions. Although the revolt was suppressed, it showed the new confidence of the common people. The plague had made clear that without workers, the great estates and cities could not survive. Religion, too, was shaken. The church had been the center of life. But during the Black Death, many clergy died while caring for the sick. Others fled in fear, abandoning their flocks. The faithful asked, "If the church holds God's power, why could it not protect us?" This did not destroy faith, but it did plant seeds of doubt. People sought more personal connections to God. In time, this would feed into movements of reform, leading centuries later to the Reformation. Art and culture reflected the trauma. A new theme appeared, the danse macabre, or dance of death. Paintings and carvings showed skeletons leading people of all ranks, kings, knights, peasants, and priests, into the grave. The message was clear. Death spares no one. It was a reminder that all humans, rich or poor, are equal in mortality. Literature also reflected this. Boccaccio's Decameron begins with young people fleeing plague-stricken Florence to tell stories in the countryside. In England, the poet William Langland wrote of visions of death and divine judgment. The plague also changed the economy. With fewer mouths to feed, food became cheaper. Meat, once rare for peasants, became more available. Forests regrew on abandoned farmland. Villages shrank, but towns sometimes grew, as survivors moved to centers of trade where opportunities were greater. Some families rose in wealth because they inherited lands and property from many dead relatives. Medicine, though powerless against the plague, also began to shift. Officials in some cities ordered the cleaning of streets and removal of waste. Quarantine was adopted more widely. The simple observation that sickness could spread from the sick to the healthy laid the foundation for the later study of contagion. Though explanations were still wrong, practices improved slowly. Let us pause to explain quarantine again. The word comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving from infected ports had to remain offshore for 40 days before passengers could disembark. This did not kill bacteria, which people did not know about, but it reduced the chance of immediate spread. This idea, that isolation could control disease, remains central to public health even today. The social transformation also affected women. With many men dead, widows inherited property or took over family businesses. In some towns, records show women running shops or managing estates. While medieval society remained patriarchal, opportunities widened in some areas, at least for a time. The memory of the Black Death never left those who lived through it. Survivors carried grief for parents, children, and neighbors. Communities remembered abandoned houses, silent churches, and endless graves. This trauma changed attitudes toward life and death. Some became more pious, building chapels or commissioning prayers for the dead. Others became more worldly, seeking pleasure and wealth while life lasted. In every corner of society, the plague forced adaptation. Nobles had to negotiate with peasants. The church had to face criticism. Families restructured after enormous loss. Towns introduced rules for cleanliness. Medicine began, however slowly, to look at prevention. The Black Death was not just a catastrophe, it was a turning point. Out of destruction came transformation. The rigid medieval world cracked, and through those cracks, a different Europe began to grow. Chapter 6: Long-term consequences. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the Black Death was fading. But the effects did not disappear with the dying. They continued to shape Europe for centuries. The long-term consequences of the plague were profound: social, economic, cultural, and even environmental. First, let us consider population. Before the Black Death, Europe may have had around 75 million people. By 1351, perhaps 25 to 30 million were gone. It took nearly 200 years for the population to recover to its earlier levels. Fewer people meant abandoned villages, overgrown fields, and empty homes. Archaeologists have found medieval villages deserted after the plague, left as silent reminders of a vanished community. This loss reshaped the economy. With fewer workers, labor became precious. Wages rose. Surviving peasants could demand more freedom and better treatment. In some places, serfdom, the system binding peasants to land, collapsed. Landlords, desperate to keep tenants, offered easier terms. Markets adapted too. With fewer mouths to feed, grain prices fell, while wages for skilled workers rose. A mason or carpenter could earn far more than before. This redistribution of wealth laid the groundwork for gradual social mobility. Environmental effects were also striking. With less land under cultivation, forests regrew across Europe. Animals flourished in abandoned fields. This rewilding gave a brief pause to centuries of deforestation. Some historians suggest that this return of forests even affected the climate, contributing to what is called the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler weather in Europe that lasted for centuries. Religious life changed deeply. Faith remained central, but trust in the church was shaken. People had prayed for deliverance, yet the plague raged on. Priests and monks died in great numbers, others fled. Survivors asked why the church, supposedly close to God, had no answer. This sowed seeds of doubt that later centuries would cultivate. Movements for reform, and eventually the Protestant Reformation, grew in part from this loss of confidence. Medicine also shifted. The plague revealed the limits of humoral theory and astrology. Though people still clung to these ideas, the importance of observation grew. Towns began keeping death records. Physicians wrote accounts of symptoms. Cities introduced new rules on sanitation. The word contagion, from the Latin contagium, meaning touching together, began to appear more often in writings. People slowly realized that diseases could spread from person to person. They did not know the true agents, but the recognition of transmission was an important step. The practice of quarantine expanded. Ports across the Mediterranean adopted the 40-day waiting period for ships from infected regions. Quarantine did not end plague, but it reduced sudden outbreaks. This principle of separating the healthy from the possibly sick remains vital in disease control today. The plague also influenced art and literature. Images of death became common. The danse macabre, or dance of death, appeared in paintings and woodcuts, showing skeletons leading people of every rank to the grave. The message was clear: death is universal, sparing no one. In literature, Boccaccio's Decameron used the setting of plague-stricken Florence as a frame for tales told by survivors. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman described visions of suffering and divine judgment. These works reflected the trauma of an age when death was ever present. Education and learning were also affected. With so many clerics and scholars dead, some universities lost staff and students. But in the longer term, survivors found greater opportunities. Endowments of land and money, left by the dead, sometimes supported schools and new institutions. The disruption of tradition opened doors for fresh thought, leading eventually to the Renaissance. Another consequence was psychological. Survivors lived with grief and fear, but also with new perspectives. Some became more devout, building chapels or commissioning prayers for the dead. Others turned to pleasure, wealth, and enjoyment, thinking life was short and uncertain. This contrast between piety and worldliness shaped the culture of late medieval Europe. Even centuries later, plague outbreaks returned. The Great Wave of 1347 to 1351 was only the beginning. Smaller outbreaks continued through the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s. The last major plague in Europe was the Great Plague of London in 1665. Each wave reminded people of the terror of the first. Each time, quarantine, isolation, and public health measures improved. The long shadow of the Black Death ensured that disease control became a permanent concern of governments. Let us pause to explain Renaissance. The word means rebirth in French. It describes the period of renewed interest in art, science, and classical learning that began in the 1400s. Some historians argue that the social and economic upheaval of the Black Death helped create the conditions for this rebirth. With old structures broken and new wealth in the hands of survivors, opportunities for creativity and innovation expanded. In summary, the long-term consequences of the Black Death were vast. It changed the balance between peasants and lords. It shook faith in the church. It encouraged new approaches to medicine and public health. It influenced art, literature, and learning. It reshaped forests and fields. It left scars, but it also cleared paths for transformation. The Black Death was not only a tragedy of the 14th century. It was a turning point in world history, echoing for centuries after the last victim had died. Chapter 7: Reflection and Legacy. The Black Death was the most devastating pandemic in recorded history. Between 1347 and 1351, tens of millions of lives were lost, entire communities vanished, and the very structure of society was transformed. Yet the story of this disease does not end in the Middle Ages. The legacy of the plague continued for centuries, and its lessons remain relevant even today. After the first great wave ended around 1351, plague did not simply disappear. Outbreaks returned again and again, sometimes in smaller waves, sometimes with great ferocity. For example, London suffered major epidemics in 1563 and 1665. The French city of Marseille faced a deadly outbreak in 1720. These later waves never matched the scale of the original pandemic, but they kept fear alive for generations. It was not until the 19th century that scientists finally understood the true cause. In 1894, a doctor named Alexander Yersin, working in Hong Kong, identified the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same tiny organism that had caused the Black Death centuries earlier. He discovered it in the bodies of plague victims and linked it to fleas and rats. This was a breakthrough. For the first time, humanity could see its invisible enemy. The plague bacterium has three main forms of disease: bubonic plague, with swollen lymph nodes or buboes; pneumonic plague, affecting the lungs, which can spread directly between people; septicemic plague, infecting the blood, often leading to blackened skin and rapid death. With modern medicine, these forms are no longer certain death. Today, antibiotics such as streptomycin, doxycycline, or ciprofloxacin can cure plague if given in time. Supportive care, including fluids and oxygen, also saves lives. But does plague still exist? The answer is yes. The disease never vanished. It survives in wild rodents and their fleas in many parts of the world. These are called natural reservoirs. From time to time, it spills over into humans. According to the World Health Organization, several hundred cases of plague are reported each year globally. In recent decades, most have occurred in places such as Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru. In the United States, a small number of cases appear almost every year, often in the rural West, in states like New Mexico, Arizona, or Colorado, where prairie dogs and wild rodents carry the bacterium. In these places, fleas occasionally infect humans. Last year, Madagascar reported dozens of cases, some in the pneumonic form. Sporadic cases were again seen in parts of Africa and a handful in the American West. Thanks to modern surveillance and antibiotics, these outbreaks are controlled quickly, and deaths are far fewer. But the fact remains. The same bacterium that killed millions in the 14th century still walks quietly among us. From the perspective of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread and affect populations, the plague is a powerful reminder of several truths. Diseases can leap across continents through trade and travel. Fear and misinformation can cause as much damage as the disease itself. And human behavior, quarantine, sanitation, medicine, shapes outcomes as much as biology does. The legacy of the Black Death is also cultural. We still speak of plague as a metaphor for disaster. The image of the plague doctor's mask remains iconic, resurfacing in art, costume, and even popular culture. The lessons of quarantine, of isolating the sick to protect the healthy, shaped public health systems that we still use in times of epidemic. More deeply, the Black Death reminds us of the fragility of human societies and their resilience. From mass graves and abandoned villages, Europe eventually rose again. Out of loss came change. The weakening of feudalism, the growth of towns, the questioning of authority, and the rebirth of art and science. As we reflect today, in 2024, it is sobering to realize that plague is not just a story of the past. It is a living disease, rare but real. It is also a mirror of how humanity responds to fear, death, and survival. The great pandemic of the 14th century may be long over, but its shadow remains. The story of the Black Death is not only about death. It is also about legacy. About how societies rebuild. About how knowledge grows from tragedy. About how humanity continues. Calm closing line. And so, as we close this long history, let us remember, the Black Death was the deadliest pandemic of the past, but its lessons still whisper to us in the present.